Welcome to another video in the video dictionary series for the course Making a Lucrative Income with Your Home Studio. The term we're going to be defining right now is compression and compressors. The history of compressors is very interesting. There's a name that you should Google if you don't know this man already. His name is Bill Putnam, and he's no longer alive. However, his sons are alive, and they're still actually working for United Audio, the company that Bill Putnam originally founded. In 1958, Bill invented something called the LA2 compressor. It was then revised and called the LA2A. And if you've been around for any amount of years, you've heard this term and probably used it many times. It's a go-to compressor in the industry, the LA2A. So that was in 1958 it was invented. And it was such a great design that it still holds true to today. Later, in 1966, Bill Putnam invented the 1176 compressor. We're going to use these two compressors because they were milestones in the history of technology for audio recording, but also because of their simple design, because this is a dictionary, this is a visual dictionary, and I want you to understand exactly every aspect, which is quite simple really, of compression. Okay, so LA2A, what does that stand for? LA stands for leveling amplifier. 2A was version 2 and revision A. So LA2A is a leveling amplifier 2A. So what's a leveling amplifier? Well, back in 1958, Bill Putnam, and again, he's a key historic figure in what we're doing. He is considered by some of the greatest engineers and producers in the industry as really the father of modern recording. He invented quite a few things that we use today. So this leveling amplifier, Bill invented because he was working in radio. And back then, when you're on radio and if there was any material that was going out on the air, somebody had to have their hand literally on the volume knob. And if something was too loud, if someone was talking too loud, or if some music was being performed too loud or played back too loud, they had to actually turn it down by hand. And then if it was too soft, they kind of turned it up and they leveled it. And he thought, man, what if we had an automatic leveling amplifier so I don't have to sit here with my hand on the volume knob? And that's pretty much what a compressor does. So the first compressors were really known as leveling amplifiers. Okay, so the simple definition of compression is automatic volume adjustment. But it goes a step further than just adjusting the volume, and we're going to take a look at that. There's 4 key terms that you need to know in order to understand compression, and they are threshold, ratio, attack, and release. Okay? Threshold, ratio, attack, and release. So threshold is simply this. Threshold is simply drawing a line. You draw the line, wherever that is, and that's going to be a volume level, and it's going to be expressed in decibels. So 0 is the top in digital recording. That's the loudest. So you might draw a line maybe around -20, let's say. That's a typical threshold or line that you draw for setting a compressor. Now, what does that mean? So you draw that line, let's say -20. Anything above that line will be affected by the compressor. It's actually going to be turned down in volume. Any sounds that are louder than -20 will be turned down a certain amount. How much they're turned down is governed by the ratio. Here's a chart showing some ratios. So 1:1 is you're not turning it down at all. You see the numbers 1 through 8? Those are lines drawn here above the threshold. The threshold is the blue line. So let's say it went all the way to 8. That would mean that you weren't turning it down at all. It made it all the way up to 8 decibels, let's say above the threshold. And you didn't turn the ratio on anything. You left it on 1:1. That would mean that for every decibel over the threshold, it allowed it to play. Now let's say you set your threshold for 2 to 1. So what does that mean? Here's what it means. Any sound that goes above the threshold will be turned down on a 2 to 1 ratio. The easiest way to figure it out is this. It's actually very simple. You just take the ratio, 2 to 1, you turn the numbers around, 1, 2, and you make a fraction. So that's a half. So a ratio of 2 to 1 means this. If the sound source was above the threshold by 8 decibels and you set your threshold to 2 to 1, which means 1/2, then instead of allowing that sound to go to 8 decibels above the threshold, the compressor will turn it down by 1/2 of those 8 decibels. So down to here, to 4 decibels above. So every time a sound shoots up above the threshold, when the ratio is set at 2 to 1, it cuts it down by half of the amount above the threshold. So 4 to 1 would be 1/4. So it would allow only 1/4 of the sound to exist above the threshold. And you can see here, it's going up only 2 decibels above 8. So if it hit 8, it would come down 1/4 of 8 down to 2. 2 is 1/4 of 8. Okay? So that's ratio. Then attack. Okay, attack is simply this. How fast does the compressor turn down those sounds that rise up above the threshold? So if the attack is fast, then let's say you have something like snare drum. Snare drum is a very fast sound. It's what we call a transient sound. Transient means very striking, hard, loud, quick. You know, a synthesizer pad would not be a transient. Someone singing would not be a transient unless they, maybe the certain consonants are like K, T, P. Those are transients. Transients are handled with compression if the attack is set very fast. So if the attack is set to a fast level, then as soon as that snare drum hits, it's going to be turned down. If the attack is slow, which the first amplifiers dealt with voices mostly and whole musical settings, the LA2A, for instance. So the LA2A is a slow attack compressor. And how it works is when a voice comes on, a voice usually doesn't get real loud right away, kind of builds up. And so the compressor naturally just kind of turns it down slowly after it starts. Now the 1176 is used a lot of times for drums. And why is that? Because it has a fast attack. So like I said, when the snare drum hits, it can turn it down right away if that's what you'd like, that kind of sound. And we're going to actually take a look in this session here at compressors in action. The last of the 4 terms that have to do with compression is release. So release would be, if the compressor turns it down, then it's going to let it go back up. And how fast it lets it go back up is the release. We're going to take a look at that now. Okay, let's take a look at compression in action. In this project, which I recently completed for 20th Century Fox, this is kind of an orchestral rock track. This has quite a few tracks on it. It's got like 290 tracks you can see here. Now this can be, you know, at first, I mean, even 4 tracks or 8 can be overwhelming when you don't know the basics. And that's why this visual dictionary is going to come in real handy for you. We're going to go over the basics so that you can understand each one at a time, and build up your education. And so even a track like this one, a project like this one, will be simple to deal with and control. And you won't feel overwhelmed or confused or frustrated, okay? Now what I did on this track is I soloed basically all the drums in the drum stem. You'll see these purple tracks right here. Okay, so let's watch compression in action. Now they all feed up through a group track up here. And I'm going to place a compressor that wasn't originally on the track here. This is a stock compressor, by the way, and this is a stock compressor that comes with Cubase is what I use. Any DAW is fine, you know, Reason, Logic, Pro Tools, Ableton, they're all great. They've all been used for hits. So now we talked about the LA2A and the 1176. Well, the interesting thing about those compressors is that if you understand how they work, you don't have to use them. I'm not saying not to, because they're great. But what they do is they do basic functions. And if you know what those functions are, you can pretty much get any compressor to perform those functions. You'll find there are quite a few A-list engineers and producers who use stock plugins, meaning the plugins that come with your DAW. In this case, this is the stock plugin for Cubase. I use it all the time. Once in a while, I'll use different compressors that do specific things that maybe they're built for, and we'll go over those as well in the course. But this is a dictionary now, so this is just the basic definition of compressor. So let's take a look at how it works. I'm going to play this track here. Now notice this diagram right here on this plugin. Very similar to the one we looked at earlier, isn't it? This dot right here that moves up and down, it will move up and down as you basically draw your line, your threshold. See the threshold button right here? Watch as I move it around. Keep your eye over here on this dot while I move the threshold button. So I'm moving it down. See the dot comes down. Moving it up, dot goes up. In this particular compressor, I can actually grab the dot and move it around. So I can adjust my threshold, meaning draw my line, which would be defined as, on this one, a horizontal line across, above which the compressor will do something. So I can do it here or here. All right, that's the threshold. Now, there's the ratio here. There's the ratio button that I can move around, the knob. Notice again, as I'm moving this ratio knob, the ratio graph moves over here. And this is exactly like the one we just looked at. So if I go 2 to 1, if I put 2 in here, you see the ratio is up 1/2 of the distance between the threshold and 0 up at the top, the loudest it could be. There it is, halfway up, 1/2. If I put 4 to 1, there it is, 1/4, just like on the diagram we showed you before. So what does all that sound like? Let's take a look. So we're going to go to 1 to 1 to begin with, which means no compression. Ratio 1, 1 to 1. And again, we'll start at kind of a default setting, which is a good place to start for compression, which is 20 minus 20. All right. Now, as we're talking about numbers, and I want you to know something. Sometimes people teach compressors and compression with numbers. Like when I said minus 20, I'm just saying it's a good place to start. But the best way to approach any plugin or any adjustment you make, and you'll hear me say it time and time again in this course, which is use your ear, not your gear, as a priority in mixing and mastering. Again, this applies definitely to compression. So yes, there's numbers here, but we're going to use our ear. All right, so let's listen to this at a 1 to 1 ratio, which will mean no additional compression here. And this will be just the drums playing. Good. Now I'm going to go back a little bit, and while I'm playing this drum track, I'm going to actually start moving some of the parameters of the compressor. Watch what I do. I'm going to first take the threshold down. I'll be going like this. Now when I take the threshold down, you won't hear anything change because the ratio is still 1 to 1, meaning it allows everything to go up. If it's 8 decibels above, it lets all 8 go. Now once I start turning it down, you'll see like 2 to 1, 3 to 1, 4 to 1. It will take the loudest sounds that are above that threshold and turn them down. So let's watch this. So here I'm moving the threshold, no difference in the volume or the sound at all. It's untouched. Now I'm going to start moving the ratio here. Right away you hear that cut down. Those are the loudest sounds. So those are the sounds above the threshold that are being turned down. The softer sounds are not being affected. It's just the louder ones. But the lower I bring the threshold, the more of the overall sound gets affected because the threshold is very low. That's where you're drawing your line. I'll go back to 1:1. Even with this really low threshold of -50, if it's 1:1, watch, no compression. See that? No compression. But let's say 2:1 at -50, that's going to be quite a bit. So we'll go 2. That's pretty dramatic. Okay. So let's take it back up to around -20. Let me type that in. -20. And we're at 2:1. This is a more typical type of place to start, again, for compression. And it's all done to taste. It's subjective. What sounds good to you. Some people like a kind of over-compressed drum sound, so I'm taking the threshold down now and the ratio. I'm increasing it 5:1. Now the style of that production is something that, you know, some people use. But when you're using a lot of compression, you'll notice that it turns everything down a lot, right? So there's a knob on many compressors which is called gain or makeup gain. And so what I can do here, and we can hardly hear the drums, they're being so compressed right now. But if I take the makeup gain, turn it up, then the overall sound is coming up. So here's how this works. Let's review this again. If the ratio is 1:1, no difference in the sound or volume of the drums. As the ratio gets turned up, based on where the threshold is, you'll hear more and more of a dramatic difference in the loud sounds getting softer. So let's say this is the style of production I want for this particular song. Quite a bit of compression. But I noticed that the track is just too quiet. So I take the makeup gain, turn it up. Now the interesting thing that happens is when you compress and then turn up your gain, your makeup gain, here's what the effect has done. The result is that the soft sounds in your track actually are louder, and your loud sounds on the track in relation to those soft sounds are quieter. So you have this difference of the loudest sounds, they've been pushed down, you know, by that ratio. And when you turn the makeup gain up, the overall thing comes up. So the loud sounds are kind of tamed, they're being held down, but the soft sounds are now louder. So you're able to hear this cutting through in the mix more, like the softer parts don't get missed. And that goes for anything, vocals, bass, you know, anything that you're compressing, is you're setting your threshold, you're setting your ratio to turn the loudest sounds down by so much, and then usually the way compressors are used is either automatically or you can set it yourself, the gain comes up. And again, this difference of the louds and soft is dynamic range. And that dynamic range, if it's too squished together, there's no, it can kind of suck the emotion out of the track and suck the punch out of it. Let's take a look at that. So if we did this, let's take a real low threshold and lots of ratio. Okay, so we're minus 43.9 threshold. Ratio is going to go up to, say, 4.50, so like about 4:1, like that's that 1/4, but with a low threshold. Now it's being really squished, right? So now I'm going to turn it up, And you see what I mean? It kind of sucks the emotion, the dynamics, you know, the louds and softs out of this track. But again, you know, there are some styles of music and some artists, and it's just all subjective, that like this sound. I'm not even saying it's good or bad. It's just a sound. It's a style. I'll show you a more typical setting now. So, -20, threshold. Let's start at 2 to 1. I'm going to bring it down a little bit more. I took the ratio down to about 3.5 to 1. And let's say I want to cut a little bit more. I'm taking my threshold lower. Okay. Let's say I like that sound. It's more pleasant to me. You know, things aren't like sticking out so much and jabbing me in the face. So now I'm going to take the overall volume up. And one thing you'll hear on this is some pumping, where kind of you can hear the compressor turning things down, like somebody moving the volume a little bit. And again, that's totally subjective. Some people like that pumping sound and they go for it. So let's bring the threshold up a little, ratio back down, around 2 to 1. And here's without it. There's with it. So you should be listening on headphones if you can. As I mentioned earlier in the course, you'll be able to hear some of these things are a little subtle. And as your ear training goes, you'll be becoming more and more adept at listening to those subtle changes. Okay, so now attack. Let's take a look at attack. So we're going to make this a little bit, again, more dramatic here. Now the attack on this particular setting is at 1, which is the fastest attack there is. So as the sounds of the drums are coming in, this thing is turning it down right away right now. Now if I make a slower attack, it's going to let, these are milliseconds, like 15 milliseconds. Still pretty fast, but it's slower than 1 millisecond, which is pretty much immediate. So at 15 milliseconds, it's a slower attack. The compressor is allowing sounds to come through at their full volume, and then it turns it down. Kind of lets them go for a minute and then turns it down. In the case, not a minute, 15 milliseconds, say a moment. Okay, and listen to this as I make the attack slower and slower. Now the attack is so slow that it's hardly compressing at all. Listen as I make the attack faster and faster. Listen to every attack of every note. There we go. Okay, so we'll do it again. We'll start with slow and speed it up, and I want you to listen very carefully. So see, that's like giving it like a total haircut. You're like chopping off the transients. And again, transients mean fast attacking sounds, very fast occurring sounds, sharp sounds. So this might be like kind of too dull and too, like, there's no energy or excitement from those hits, you know? So I might, and if that's the case, then you'll want to take the attack and slow it down. Let some of those hits through, while still turning down the overall sound of the drums after they hit right away. See, even that's nicer. 16 milliseconds. Now watch that. 16 milliseconds compared to 1 millisecond, pretty much immediate. Watch. Let's go to around 30. Very much slower. Now it's letting more and more of the initial hit, the initial transient, to come through before it turns it down. Okay. Again, that's a very slow attack. fast attack. This blue bar that's coming down shows you how much the compressor is turning things down. So when I have a slow attack, watch how much it's turning it down and how fast it's turning it down. Watch when I have a fast attack. We'll go back to that same area. Here's slow. There's fast. It's coming down right away and it's coming down further. Because it's being hit harder, it's going to come down further because it's got to abide by the ratio, in this case 4.7 to 1. So when it's slower, it's not going to move as fast, and it's not going to be catching as much loudness because the loud thing already happened and then it's allowing itself to turn down. Those secondary sounds are not as loud, so it won't cut down as much. So this is key to see how all this works and not just understand the knobs and the numbers, but to get in there like I'm doing right now and experiment with this stuff and listen to how it operates in real life. Now the final term is release. Let's take a look at release. Let's see what happens. Now you saw this blue line that comes down here? You see it happening here? Well, when it goes back up, that's the compressor releasing. So the compressor doesn't turn things down and keep it there forever. It turns it down and lets go. Now how fast it lets go is the release. So let's take a look at that. Now that's a very fast release. It does turn it down. You'll see with the blue line right here. But it lets go of it right away because it's so fast here. Now as I slow up the release, see how this kind of looks a little more sluggish on its way back up? Because it's slowly releasing, slowly letting the volume come back up. Let's listen very carefully to what that sounds like. Here's a really slow release. There's a fast release. And that's got a little bit of an odd sound to it if you listen real closely, because the initial hits are being turned down and then it's letting it go back up fast. In fact, if I turn the attack now on immediate and the release immediate, that means all the loudest hits are getting turned down and then it's letting it go back up. Now slow release. Overall volume comes down and it's just kind of slowly letting things up. You can see here good on this breakdown section, because you can watch, like after that snare, see how fast it goes? Right there. Look when it's immediate. See how fast it goes up? Very fast. Okay, so that's showing you the basics on compression of threshold, ratio, attack, and release. Again, there's other buttons to consider, but we're looking at the basic definition of compression. So feel free to look at all the other dictionary definitions in this visual dictionary in the course Making a Lucrative Income with Your Home Studio.